Today, people might say we've come a long way in women's rights. But with the introduction of foreign men from overpopulated countries who have their own traditions and ways that exclude women, we've been faced with pressures to turn back the hands of time. Today our local peoples face persecution. We're being told that the women's place is in the household, that the children's places are on the playgrounds, that they don't want to work because they're lazy. They're not meant to work. We should make way for more foreigners to take jobs. This is obvious gaslighting by desperate populations indoctrinated by religious practices who are plagued with their own overpopulation that can't seem to get a handle on. We know we've got women who need to work to support their households. We've got children who need to work to also help those households or pay for their educations. If today's need wasn't enough for you, let's look at ancient history. In a region called Thessaly in Greece, the peoples worshipped a goddess called Enodia. She was a working woman, not a wife. Enodia was the world's first contract worker. If you had a problem you needed help with, you'd go to Enodia to help you, and she would do it. On today's episode of the Musings of Rin, I'm going to talk about Enodia. Let's start by looking at the part of the world she was worshipped in to get a feel for the peoples and what they believed in and why they might have needed her. Her worship was pretty much isolated in the region of ancient Thessaly in Greece. This is a place stretching from Mount Olympus to the north, Pelion and Ossa ranges to the east, Mount Othrys to the south, and the Pindos Mountains to the west. Now, most people will know Mount Olympus was the seat of power for the Olympian Greek gods, but did you know Mount Othrys was the seat of power for Cronos and Rhea, the titans that came before them? It is also cited to be the birthplace of the gods. In the foundation of Greek mythology, Gaia created a community from 4 peoples. Gaia herself was a black turtle, and they were from the north. She was the personification of the earth. The sky man Uranus was of red bird to the south. The sea man Pontus came from blue dragon to the east. The mountain man Orea was of white tiger to the west. Her children, the Titans, were born of the sky man Uranus. Now, Cronos and the Titans came into power in this region during Gigantomachy. Basically, Uranus was producing too many mutant children, seen to be unhealthy or a danger to their community. They had 1 eye, 1 arm, many arms, webbed feet, animal bodies, and tails instead of human forms. Very likely, we are either seeing the product of incest in a shallow gene pool, or the use of fear and tricksters to maintain control over the surrounding peoples. When the small community didn't have the resources for all their peoples, they would exile the ones that didn't fit into the community ideal. They prioritized the whole and the loyal and the good, and the criminal tricksters and those who were unhealthy were basically spreading anger and chaos, so they removed them. Now, the mothers and exiled children didn't agree with what was going on. Maybe some of those children were being judged unfairly. They didn't understand the consequences of, playful tricks. They plotted with an exiled titan, Cronus, to castrate Uranus and send him into the underworld. Perhaps they wanted him to understand what he was exiling his children to, that they wanted to prevent him from producing any more mutant children in the underworld. Exiles were called dead because the perception was outside the community, you were gone, you were dead, you weren't going to survive. So to send someone to exile was a very, very cruel thing to do to someone. You were basically cutting their life short. The castration of Uranus created Aphrodite. She was a fertility goddess who was said to come from the seas, where the blood of castrated Uranus fell. It also gave birth to the Furies, who were warrior women who tried to avenge crimes out in the underworld. And it also gave birth to the nymphs. These were women associated with a geographical regional landmark, either a river or a mountain. So it appears after this war, the community actively changed their ways. Previously, they were trying to hide the act of sex from their peoples to prevent overpopulation. As they were creating this community, they didn't have the resources to support overpopulation. So they controlled who was allowed to give birth. So in the terms of their ritual rebirth and reproduction rites, their first approach was having one ritual father and mother to, produce children for the entire community. But by the third generation, where the father was trying to impregnate his grandchildren, they discovered the problem with incest and genetic mutations. The result was they had to create this fertility goddess and a temple to support having many fathers produce healthier children. They also took in outsiders to widen the gene pool. I mean, 4 people with 12 kids was not going to be a wide enough gene pool to avoid mutations. Now, the plains of Thessaly that hosted Enodia were the war grounds of Titanomachy. This was a 10-year war for control of the region and the religious faith of the peoples, between Cronus's Othrians and the Olympians that would eventually settle on Mount Olympus. The Olympians were led by Zeus, an exiled child of their peoples, who was probably a product of overpopulation and improper management. It was said that Cronus turned into a tyrant exactly like his father Uranus. He was swallowing his children as soon as they were born to prevent them from someday overthrowing him. It sounds like he was killing kids instead of exiling them. Did he think this was kinder? Swallowing them, hopefully he wasn't practicing cannibalism because they were dealing with resource starvation. It sounds like they were still trying to figure out how to manage the rules for the fertility temples. Now Rhea hid Zeus from Cronus in the underworld, with the nymphs at Crete. These were the daughters of Oceanus, one of the Titans. One version says Zeus was directed to return to the lands of his father because Hera, one of the early Gaian mother goddesses of Crete, saw that a child of a fertility temple went out into the underworld in Egypt and became a ruler. She feared that Zeus would try to take over territory in the same way. Now we have the story of Io, who was chased by Zeus and impregnated. Isis landed on the shores of Egypt, and she became a goddess there. This implies that Hera wasn't Zeus's wife, but she was a Gaian mother goddess meant to administrate a region. Zeus was seen as a problem in his youth. He was chasing women and abusing their sexual rights. Now, most of the Titans fought on the side of Cronus. The exceptions were Themis and her son Prometheus, who fought with Zeus, and Oceanus, who stayed neutral. Probably because both sides were his allies, he didn't really care who won. Now Zeus had the aid of Athena, Artemis, and Apollo. When Zeus won the war with the help of these folks, and with some of the early Gaians, the Titans were sent into exile in the underworld instead. So this region of Thessaly was put into the hands of a group of peoples whose beliefs were somewhere between the early Gaian peoples, led by Gaia and Uranus, and the late Gaian peoples, led by Cronus and Rhea. They divided the region into the control of 3 brothers: Zeus, who ruled the skies, or the Gaian range bounded by the mountains in Thessaly; Poseidon, who ruled the seas, or the island of Crete, surrounded by the Mediterranean; and Hades, who ruled the underworld, possibly Egypt or the mainland regions in Anatolia, Turkey, around the Mediterranean. The other gods were assigned duties based on their skill sets and attributes, and they took up worship in different regions of Greece. Perhaps Zeus ruled on Mount Olympus, Poseidon was just a new form of Oceanus who lived on Crete, and they made the newly exiled Cronus, or the formerly exiled Uranus, who was already out there managing the underworld, the leader there. Now these 3 men would have represented the 3 major factions during Titanomachy. One very interesting fact is none of the Olympian gods were allowed to place a major temple inside this region of Thessaly. The 2 closest gods were Zeus at Dion, just outside the borders of Thessaly near Mount Olympus, and Demeter at Thermopylae, just outside the borders of Thessaly near Mount Othrys. It implies that the Thessalian plain was for the gods, and that they serviced the people outside the mountain range boundaries. So Zeus was sent to a woman and raised by early Gaians, alongside Hera, who might have been the next reigning Gaia on Crete. All the stories of Hera punishing the children imply that she was attacking the concept of overpopulation and migration and, wandering wayward men. She was trying to build successful communities and Men were seen as the problem in this case. Women were obviously in power if they were the ones trusted to teach and guide and protect the man who would become their reigning god. By calling Hera his wife, they attempted to put Zeus in a position of authority over her. Was this a willing alliance to regain control of the heavens for early Gaians? Or was this a usurp of authority to later minimize Hera's power in the underworld, or Poseidon's realm, and redirect faithful to Zeus instead? It sounds like perhaps they were warring for the hearts and minds and control of their peoples, but they were stuck in this three-party faction. Around 1600 BC, the Santorini volcano erupted. This created floods and tsunamis and displaced Poseidon and his peoples across the region. The Dorians, who were likely Poseidon's faithful, pushed folks off the islands of Rhodes and Kos, displacing them to Zeus's territory on the Greek mainland and Hades' territory in the underworld in Asia Minor, or Turkey. This in turn displaced Hera, Apollo, and Artemis, and their movement across the region increased the factions of peoples. Now, if we take a look at the surrounding region of Greece and compare this with Enodia's cults and the surrounding major temple sites, we can see which peoples supported Enodia. These were the Aeolians, who were the Gaians, the Attic, who were Athena's peoples, and the Ionians, who were Hera and Artemis's peoples. The Dorians, who were managed by Poseidon, did not support the concept of Enodia. Interestingly enough, he also did not support Apollo or his son Asclepius in either their oracle temples or their hospitals. So it appears as if Enodia, Apollo, and Asclepius' services were specific to Zeus's people. Only Athena appeared to be welcome to both Poseidon and Zeus. Perhaps she was the one set to arbitrate between the two. Athena temples sat between the different peoples. So Athena's temple in Athens sat between Zeus and Poseidon. Her temple at Rhodes sat between Poseidon and the underworld. Her temple on the Ionic mainland of Asia Minor sat between Zeus, Poseidon, and the underworld, and the region that became managed by Hera and Artemis. Was Hera and Artemis recognized as a new faction, or was that just an early temple site protecting them from the underworld? Now, inside the plains of Thessaly, there were two major cities that mentioned Enodia in archaeological evidence, Pherae and Larissa. Thessaly is important to mythology as being the birthplace of Achilles, the hero of Troy. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, was said to have died here as well. Larissa is the largest city in the region. It was primarily used as an agricultural center, so Demeter would have been very important here. There are actually multiple Larissas in the world. There's another one in Syria, and this was created by wars over Asia Minor, which traded hands between the Indo-Europeans, the Greeks, and the Persians. The Larissa in Syria took its name during the occupation of the Seleucid Empire, where migrating folks from Thessaly moved to Syria. Perhaps they were evicting the Persians who had come into Greece back to the Middle East. But some folks from Thessaly were incorrectly displaced, and they wanted to remember their home. Now, during the Thera floods, this region would have been managed by Egypt during the New Kingdom period. They would have displaced the Sumerian or Semitic tribes that had been occupying the region after they took it from other peoples in their own flood displacement of the Euphrates rivers. This is the biblical Noah flood or the Sumerian flood. That flood was said to be created for a punishment for overpopulation in the region. There was a fertility temple around Uruk and Eridu that had changed the rules. It used to be fertility temples were allowed to offer you one child, a boy or girl, no promises. This particular site promised 3 children, all boys. Now, based on today's understanding of fertility, we know you can't guarantee the gender of your child. So to get 3 boys, you'd be creating multiple girls too. They were adding more peoples than the population was increasing. They'd need more resources and water, food, and clothing to support them. They'd need to increase the number of jobs in their cities or end up with a bunch of criminal thieves. The overpopulation, they found, was causing havoc on the surrounding communities. Now, who were these original owners of the Syrian territory? Well, it appears they were people called Ebla. It's unclear what their racial makeup actually was. They could have been Indo-European, they could have been Greek, they could have been Egyptian, or they could have been Sumerian. Or maybe they were even some multicultural makeup between the 4 peoples, as they actually lived between the other kingdoms and traded with them. The Persians claim they were migratory peoples who lived in Sumeria during 3000 BC, but they don't explicitly have a record of the lands they occupied there. Migrants didn't occupy cities. They also claim Scythia, which was north of the Black Sea, which was clearly Indo-European. Now, Scythia was a female-dominated society, much like the Phrygians, and it appears like the early Gaians. Islamic Persia, we can see, definitely is not. So, I think it's more likely they were a tribe of exiled men from Sumeria, displaced in the Ur flooding, who went north over the mountains instead of towards Ebla. The Persians didn't have women, so they were taking them from Scythia around the Black Sea. I don't believe the Eblan women were taken by them because they were on the wrong side of the Euphrates during the flood. Now, just south of here in southern Syria, they had a witchy Enodia-like woman called Astarte, who was worshipped in Phoenician city-states. She was a lion goddess associated with chariots. She was very similar to the Norse symbology for Freya, as well as Greek Artemis. We know Artemis had moved with the Ionians to, Asia Minor, Anatolia, Turkey. Perhaps she was more of their peoples from there. Now, it's not clear where Artemis came from before Titanomachy. Norse Freya was said to be a daughter of Njord, possibly a Noah, who took a Jotun wife, possibly Indo-European, around Anatolia, Turkey. So perhaps Artemis was part Sumerian and part Indo-European, Anatolian. Maybe the Jotun were the Eblans who were displaced north into Turkey by the Sumerians. The last possibility appears to be an Israelite tribe called Dan that is slowly being eliminated in the Canaan region by the other families of Israel. Now, the first dynasty of Egypt was ruled by Neith supporters. Mer Neith was thought to be the first female pharaoh of Egypt. She had a son called Den, who supposedly ruled over Egypt for a time. Perhaps Dan wasn't an Israelite family at all. Maybe they were displaced, non-inheriting descendants of Den, who were actually Egyptian. Den had a sister called Ahanith, which was buried with his father. His father had ruled over Egypt after Mernith. Perhaps his father usurped his mother and then replaced his sister's rule. Had a bunch of kids, because they weren't following the rules on the mainland down south here, and they settled them out in Lower Syria, Dan territory. This would have been near Petra. Perhaps Astarte's temple was at Petra. Now Ebla was just north of the Canaan region. Maybe the Ebla were the Dan and they got displaced south into Egypt during the 6th dynasty. Or maybe they were the Phoenicians who supported Astarte. Regardless of who they actually were, we can see that overpopulation increases caused migration displacements. Environmental calamities caused massive migration displacements. So the surrounding communities were struggling to handle these changes. So we're at a time in the world where, everyone's struggling for resources, everyone needs help. This is a prime time to create someone like Enodia, a helper who will solve problems for you. Pharai is the city in Thessaly where Enodia was said to have been left as an orphan. It raised her. Was she another displaced migrant? Or was she another child who was abandoned due to her family's lack of resources? Enodia was first mentioned as being a primary deity during the Ionian migration that occurred around 1100 BC. The Apollo oracle advises Naupes, who's the son of the Archon of Athens, that if he wanted to defeat his enemies, the Ionian migrants revolting at Erythrae, he would need to seek the counsel of a priestess of Enodia. So he brought Chrysame with him across the Aegean Sea. She devised a method to dose a bull with hallucinogenic herbs, so that anyone who ate the bull would also get infected. When they released the bull at the enemy forces, the Ionians killed it and consumed it for food, also succumbing to the drug. Therefore, they easily defeated their enemies. Perhaps she was attempting to resolve the problem with the least amount of casualties. We can see that the priestess of Enodia combined her knowledge of plants as well as her understanding of peoples and strategies to come up with a plan that would solve their problem. So from this story we know that Enodia had to be born sometime before 1100 BC, and long enough before that to grow up, get educated, gather popularity, and have some temples erected in her name. So where did she come from then? Well, we know that the Ionian migration was caused by displacement of Achaean Dorians, folks that moved from Rhodes to mainland Greece. In the myth of Delphine and Apollo, it talks about how Apollo takes ownership of the oracle site at Delphi. The god kills the sea serpent here, either female Delphine or male Python. They were the foster parents of Typhon, an underworld creature of chaos. Typhon was associated with the hippopotamus. He might have had leprosy because when untreated it makes hands and feet kind of look like a hippopotamus's feet. It might explain why a child of Hera, which is what he claimed to be, was out in the underworld. Typhon attempted to overthrow Zeus for control of the cosmos. Typhon was said to have stolen something from Zeus, perhaps part of his body, and placed it at Delphi under the guard of Delphine. His foster mother, Delphine, was blamed for making the lands around Delphi inhospitable. It's unclear whether this occurred before or after she appeared there. It appears like Apollo was trying to take whatever was stolen back. They claim Typhon got buried under Mount Etna in Sicily after he was defeated. Perhaps Hera's placement on the farther shore during the Ionian migration shows that she was supporting an invasion force. Maybe they lost faith in her and moved her further away. Now, interestingly enough, Typhon was associated with Set, and Hermes was associated with Thoth in a city called Hermopolis in Egypt during the Old Kingdom period between 2700 BC to 2200 BC during the displacement of Ebla. Was Typhon's forces invading Greece from Ebla? Did Hermes Thoth also enter Greece during Typhon's rebellion and attack on Delphi? The caduceus he was holding was first documented by Babylonians in 3500 BC. Ebla started as a small trading settlement in 3500 BC. It's possible that this attack was caused by Sumerian displacement caused by the flood of Ur. Now, Thoth had a daughter, Seshat. She was a female scribe claimed to invent writing. Her mother was Ma'at, a goddess of law and order, very like Themis, the oracle at Delphi. She was measuring monuments, hospitals, and temple structures during the first dynasty of Egypt. She was associated with funerary rites. Seshat herself did not have a temple or cult in Egypt. Apollo was asked to serve 1 year as a mortal in Pherae for killing Delphine at Delphi, the site of Themis's power. He was sent to work in Admetus's home here as a herdsman. It's interesting that the same place that Apollo was sent to is where baby Enodia was discovered. Was Enodia liberated by Apollo and brought with him to Pherae? Was she the stolen item from Zeus? And in return for bringing her back, he gained admission to the heavens for his service to the Greek peoples? Did she follow after, being returned to him after the events at Delphi? Did one of the attackers rape the seated oracle, or a priestess there? Was Apollo a local at the temple fighting for his country and saving the next generation of oracles? Or, if, like mythology states, his twin Artemis were representations of the Freyr and Freya from Asia Minor, were they participating with Dorian Hera and Egyptian Typhon and Hermes in an invasion of the heavens? Did Typhon sacrifice his foster parents to discredit Hera, who he claimed to be related to? Were they trying to uplift Apollo, Artemis, and Hermes' status to more important roles? Were they trying to recreate the Seshat pattern by raping an oracle, much like Ma'at? Was Enodia a product of this plot? Was she the daughter of one of the invading men? It looks like the result of all of this chaos was, due to the massive amounts of migration into Greece, they sent Hera and Artemis back to Asia Minor with Dionysus in tow, along with a group of Ionian colonists in 1100 BC. Due to the previous story about Enodia's priestess, we can see they weren't entirely willing. Now, why Dionysus? Well, he didn't have a clear parentage. They believed he came from Thrace and was named by Hermes, who could have been from Egypt. They claimed he was a son of Zeus and Persephone, but we know Persephone was, the queen of the underworld. They also claimed he was a child of Zeus and Semele, but Semele's father was Cadmus, the founder of Thebes, whose mother was a nymph of Egypt. So, based on everything he was saying, he was either sourced from Egypt or the underworld, which is probably why he got sent back out with the women there. If all of his stories were untruths, I guess it's kind of his own fault for trying to make up a story because he got held accountable for it. So, regardless of her actual source and who might have put her there, Enodia grew up educated, an adopted child of Thessaly and Pherae. She was sometimes depicted on coins in Thessaly as a young woman riding a horse carrying torches. The Greek goddesses were given epithets, which were essentially word labels explaining traits associated with them. Enodia's were Alexiadis, meaning averter of evil, Astike, meaning of the city, Korotara, meaning which makes one grow, Korillos describes a connection to the ancient feminine world, Osea has a connection to purifications, Patroa, meaning ancestral or paternal, Pheraia, meaning associated to the city Pherae, Strogike, meaning a bringer of light, Stathmia implied a connection to the animal realm or being stable, Swastika, they thought meant an urban aspect. Now, the swastika is an Indo-European Sanskrit word meaning health and good fortune. It was thought to have been sourced north of the Black Sea and was used extensively by Buddhists in Asia. Yes, this is the symbol that was adopted by German Nazis. Perhaps it symbolizes the fact that Enodia was helping both local folks and outsiders, that the outsiders associated her with helping them with health problems, or thefts which would attack their wealth. Enodia had visual images associated with her as well. There were plants, a myrtle garland, and the rose, as well as animals, dogs, which were said to be very sacred to her, and horses. She was one of the 12 gods worshipped in the region called the Dodecatheon. The 6 gods were Zeus, Poseidon, Apollo, Ares, Hephaestus, and Hermes. The 6 goddesses were Hestia, Demeter, Enodia, Aphrodite, Athena, and Themis. The Thessalians excluded the other gods Hera, Artemis, Dionysus, Hades, Persephone, who did not live on Olympus. The first 3 were moved to Asia Minor during the Ionian displacement. Hades and Persephone were somewhere else in the underworld. Now, it's interesting to draw parallels between the goddesses that were represented and included with the female roles in society. Hestia, Aphrodite, and Demeter made up the fertility caste of women in their roles of daughter, mother, crone, a sort of triad triple goddess pattern. Hestia was the dutiful daughter, essentially a virgin student. Aphrodite was a fertility priestess, a birth mother. Demeter was the wizened aged mother, the agricultural goddess and administrator of resources and the fields that fed their peoples and kept them alive. These three women seemed to manage life itself. Hestia was the youth, where not much was asked from you beyond to follow the rules and educate yourself. As a mother, you created new life, and as the aged mother, you produced resources that would keep peoples alive. Now, Enodia, Athena, and Themis made up the cast of women in their roles as daughter, mother, crone that managed the community and society, not just life. Enodia was a virgin scholar and healer. She was like an apprentice, always learning. Athena was a virginal warrior and skilled laborer. She represented a mentor instead of a mother. Themis was associated with justice and law. She was the wizened expert instead of the grandmother crone. She served at the Oracle of Delphi. Now, unlike her younger two counterparts, she was not a virgin. Her children were the Seasons and the Fates. The Seasons guarded the gates of Olympus. The Fates were administrators. Clotho managed births, or the permission to be born. Lachesis managed life, your purpose and role in the heavens. And Atropos managed deaths, when to kill or exile you. Enodia's priestesses, like her, were all virgins, and they were known to be herbalists. It appears as if she used her skill set to support the roles of the other five goddesses. To Hestia, she was a teacher. To Aphrodite, a midwife or abortionist. To Demeter, a healer and herbalist. To Athena, a messenger or gatekeeper. To Themis, an investigator or poisoner. Now, today most cultures offloaded these roles to men. Only teacher, midwife, and nurse traditionally were still performed by women until the modern women's suffrage rights in the Western world. Though women these days are being displaced from jobs again due to the overpopulation migration coming from the Eastern world. We're just seeing the same thing that Enodia's women had to deal with back in ancient times. Now, Enodia's women were working women. They were problem solvers utilizing intelligence or herbalist skills. She'd collect an offering and try to solve your problem for you through scholarly methods that seemed mystical to peoples lacking her skills in primitive times. She was easy to find. She sat at the borders of the city on the crossroads, right beside the local cemetery. Everyone knew where she was because everyone passed her on the way in or out of the city. This made it a good location for a business. During the day it got a lot of foot traffic. Not only workers leaving the city and returning at the end of the day, but also folks coming to the city in trade or travel. During the night, it was far enough from the inner city to provide discretion when dealing with sensitive matters such as those abortions. If someone was ill, it moved the ailment away from the center of the city into her halls. Perhaps it was safer and prevented it from spreading. If she needed her own gardens, ready and accessible, well, she was next to the fields with the best growing lands. The location itself shows extreme intelligence in their women. Now, unfortunately, as the population increased, more and more peoples, especially men, noticed the profiteering aspect of impersonating her role. You'd get tricksters and con artists trying to extort money to replace her services. The pattern of witchcraft started being applied to Enodia and women practicing her role as a form of negative marketing. For example, purifications were meant to be herbal medicines. They were to help you with illnesses or the removal of unwanted children. The fake folks provided false cures or exorcism rituals which effectively did nothing or weren't needed. Instead of protection charms and talismans that were being used to ward off demons, she was supposed to give advice in securing your home or persons from thieves and criminals, or help track them down and remove crime in the city by solving and doing detective work. She was linked to keys and boxes. Perhaps she sold locked boxes to keep things hidden and secured out of sight so they wouldn't be coveted and stolen by other folks. The fake peoples provided charms, which you would have to display openly to indicate you paid their protection fees, which meant they wouldn't steal from you. The De Falsis Deus was a classic Latin homily, essentially a religious lecture. It told us that there was a god that got blamed for this type of behavior. There once lived a man named Mercury, who was very deceitful and, though quite wise in speech, was treacherous in actions and lies. The pagans, in their accounts, also made him their great god and often and frequently offered him sacrifices at crossroads through the teachings of the devil and to high hills that often brought various offerings of praise. Now, Mercury would have been the Hermes equivalent in this pantheon. If you remember from earlier, he was already suspicious. He would have had some similar roles in common with Enodia. He too was a messenger and dealt with thieves. Perhaps this implied the women were noted to be more trustworthy or capable in dealing with problems of this nature. Maybe he was using a form of negative marketing to gain more business for his own cult. His cult was found in remote regions, where peoples were less educated and more trusting. Therefore, there was less legal consequences for playing tricks. Perhaps he was one of those con men. Apollo also competed with Enodia for business as a protector of public streets and home entrances. He was also the new owner of the oracle at Delphi. Apollo propagated these temples across the known region. There ended up being 7 major temples in total, 3 on mainland Greece, 1 in the island of the Aegean, and 3 on the mainland Asia Minor. It's interesting that the number 7 is the same number of daughters of Themis, the old oracle owner. Did Apollo move the gatekeepers and judges of heaven elsewhere to get them out of the way? Were these real temples? Did Themis support their creation, or was she being usurped? The oracles were consulted during legal practices. Did they need more judges out in the main lands because there were too many conflicts? Apollo's son Asclepius was uplifted to be a regional healer, and they were building hospital sites across the region. Before, Enodia was the person you'd go to for health issues and herbal remedies. Now, Asclepius was said to bring folks back from the dead for payment. Hades accused him of stealing subjects from the underworld. Now, remember, dead are exiled folks, so either they're there for crimes committed in the heavens, or diseases making them dangerous to keep around. A lot of the descriptions of Asclepius' healing rituals sound very bogus, like the licking of wounds by dogs, and the treatment prescribed by interpreting dreams. Non-venomous snakes would slither freely across the dorm floors where sick and injured slept. It's kind of unlikely he would be curing diseases in these ways. Were these folks also being hit by a series of bad marketing and con artists? Or were they the con artists themselves? One man, an Alexander of Abonotychus, claimed his god Glycon was Asclepius. He was a living snake with an artificial head made out of linen, which basically sounds like an Egyptian man with one of their hooded robes. He was supposedly very good looking and a charismatic speaker. Perfect for con artistry, actually. He was trained by a fake doctor in 150 CE. He sold charms during plagues, practiced blackmail, forged documents, and gave vague solutions to problems. He ended up dying from gangrene at the age of 70, thought of as a charlatan. Now, in 500 BC, the Persians were encroaching on Asia Minor, and at this time they drew similarities between Enodia and Hecate. In 400 BC, Enodia Hecate had written a document on the sacred disease. It described fake diseases created by gods. Her debunking of their tricks was meant to shame them into stopping them. The Hippocratic Oath, sworn by doctors, was developed in 275 AD. Perhaps somebody went back to all these folks and tried to make them take the vocation seriously. It implies, as a peoples, we knew that there were Dr. Con artists, and we were asking them to swear an oath and take it seriously, or there would be consequences for breaking the rules. In today's society, with foreigners claiming you need foreign doctors, it makes you wonder if these foreign doctors swear that same oath, or this is just the same thing we saw before, they're just con artists. Now, we can see we've got a pattern of men taking or moving into the business roles of women. But they're not doing it by doing the job, they're doing it by impersonating the job. They're bullshitting, essentially. Did Apollo and his son Asclepius discredit Enodia and Themis? Were they profiteering to take their purpose away, or remove them as authority figures? Was Hermes participating in this? They basically took the idea of Enodia's role and turned it into that of a crossroads demon. In Great Britain, they buried criminals and suicides at crossroads. In Western cultures, they would draw symbols on the ground to summon spirits. In African hoodoo, they would communicate with the dead. It makes you wonder if these myths surrounding crossroads originate from the role of Enodia. If someone was killed committing a crime or died suspiciously, perhaps a client would want closure or evidence of innocence. They would submit the body to Enodia so she could investigate and advise the Office of Justice of her findings. Perhaps she was performing autopsies or investigating their persons before burial. Maybe she was just handling generic funerary services for peoples. Perhaps the concept of talking to the dead was more abstract, and she was analyzing the dead for other reasons. Many of the god patterns was you would leave an offering and, pray for help from the gods, but you didn't speak to a person or a priest directly. Perhaps this drawing of the symbol on the ground was meant to explain what the problem you had was, and they were hoping she'd get back to them. I'd be afraid if you left payment, though, for this type of work, it'd be stolen or picked up by someone else. There's no guarantee someone will look at the request. Perhaps this pageantry was coming from the con artists. It was telling people to go lose money and get angry with Enodia for their own mistake. In the end, she served in temples shared with the father god Zeus. Perhaps his presence in the temple protected her from the male population by providing a stronger male presence to prevent her from being fully displaced. Offerings made to Enodia included small bronze and iron objects, some jewelry, but mostly brooches called fibulae. These were practical objects, pins meant to fasten garments and affix funerary clothing and burials. There were also small bird and animal figurines, especially dogs, horses, bulls, and snakes. Also, many female terracottas. Between 500 and 400 BC, her cult spread outwards from Thessaly into Macedonia and parts of Thrace. She was linked to Artemis and Hecate during this time of Persian influence. Hecate was often associated more with the negative witchy behaviors of Enodia's cult. Her base of operation was in Asia Minor, so perhaps this comparison was meant to discredit her in the region where Persians were advancing. There is a stele dated between the 1st and 2nd century depicting Enodia wearing a chiton poveris. It's basically a tunic that was fastened at the shoulders, and she wore it cross-girdled across her chest. It used to be secured with brooches that were donated as pins to her temple, but when women were found to use those as protective weaponry, they were changed in fashion to be buttons instead. She was also present on coins and the Thessalian calendar, but after 196 AD, she disappeared. Rome had just defeated Philip V of Macedonia and Thessaly. The Roman legions basically crushed them. They kept the region intact as a buffer state. It's not really clear what happened to Enodia before, during, or after that battle. At this point, she disappears. Did they move Enodia and her cult during the war to keep them safe? In current times, we don't really know. Enodia came out of one of the earliest communities in the world, the ancient Gaian world, and her cult spent at least 1,200 years serving the needs of her peoples. If she had been put there by outside forces of Crete, Asia Minor, and Egypt to take over Greece, then she doesn't appear to have participated in the ploy. She was a stabilization force for the region. Despite her dubious origins, she stayed within the boundaries of Thessaly, so they must have appreciated her presence and service. She had an important vocation and did the job despite having to work around the negative marketing and anti-female propagandas coming from con artists and men trying to discredit and steal from her peoples. She proved a great role model for women in showing them that women were capable of working, even as they were being surrounded by more and more men. She still appeared to outpace the men and do a great job. She combated the negative press and stayed relevant by simply providing a good service as long as she could. It's actually great advice when facing adversity, relevant even today. So next time someone tells you a woman is only good for cooking, cleaning, and making babies, or that women are treated better in the working world than men, tell them the story of Enodia. That's it for this week's episode. Until next time.